Hey, it's Jessi, and welcome to the Everyday Philosopher. Today, I'm going to be telling the story about the time that I talked to a fish. So, if that sounds like an interesting story, then be sure to stay tuned. The fish story. One of the highlights of my college career. In order to fully understand the fish story, though, you have to know a few basic things. First, this occurred during my freshman year of college when I came in completely undecided. I had no idea what major I wanted to do, but I was kind of leaning towards biology at the time. So, naturally, I was in this botsozoology lab and course. We had this nasty 3-hour lab that we would meet twice a week, in which we would talk about biology. Our lab, we had this very nice but very strict professor. She ran our class like a military style, and everyone was secretly afraid of her. She had us get into groups of 4, and everyone in my group was nice. It was fine, whatever, it was a decent group. And for our experiment this week, we were looking at carbon dioxide levels in water and photosynthesis and kind of like that whole relationship. As you can tell, I would make a marvelous scientist. And so what we did is we had these little beakers. Now I know this isn't a beaker, but this was the closest thing I could find. And in our beaker we filled it, about halfway up, so it was just a little bit of water in it. And then we had a little fish. Again, I don't know the type of fish, just because the experiment was a long time ago. But the little fish, sat in this, beaker, and then we put saran wrap over the top, and we waited for a little bit, and we did, other lab stuff. And the point of the lab was afterwards we would take the fish out, and then we would measure the carbon dioxide levels in the water. Very simple, right? So the end of the experiment comes, and it's time to measure the water, and I got put in charge of putting the fish back. Now everyone else is cleaning up, and I was like, no problem, I can put the fish back, like it won't bother me at all. But secretly I was very nervous about it, because this meant, having to take my hand, stick it in the container, and pulling the fish out and putting it in the water. You couldn't just dump the water in the container, because the water is what we needed. And so I'm on my way to go put the fish back, and everyone is just so busy moving about, cleaning things up and such, and I'm looking at my fish, and I'm beginning to think about just how much this lab sucks and how much I hate this class. And I try to keep a positive attitude, but I hate this class right now. And then I take a moment to step back and to breathe, and I think about, positive thoughts, positive energy, all that stuff. And about how this class is, just temporary. It's going to get out in about a half an hour, and then I won't have to deal with it again for another week. And in the end, this class is not my end. Life will go on. Eventually, I will pass this class. I will move on. A year from now, this class will be in a blur. And 20 years from now, I won't even remember this lab, at all, or even this class, at all. It's not that significant, even though right now it's a really big deal. It's not that significant in the long run. But then I start thinking about this poor little fish, and I know that a fish's memory is not very good, but I can't help but think that this fish was probably bred for this experiment. It was bought for in my tuition money and like that for this experiment. And its whole life and its whole purpose is raised around this, experiment and like that. And if I really wanted to, I could just, kill this fish. Its whole life and its whole power and all of that is in my hands. And I was thinking about this, and while I'm thinking about it, I end up looking into the fish, and we end up we make eye contact. Our eyes are together, and we're looking at each other, and I'm thinking about this fish's life, and the future of this fish and all of that. And again, it's important to note that I'm not on drugs here, but in this moment, this fish starts to talk to me. We're not saying words to each other, but our minds are connecting, and this fish is telling me about its life in captivity, and about, it doesn't like being in this little, tiny container, and how it wants to be free, and all of that. And I'm, sympathetically, listening to this fish, and thinking about this fish and this fish's life, and all of that. And I'm probably like all Socrates style here, you know. I have this like container up in the air and I'm like, you know, drooling at it and stuff. And that is when my professor goes, Jessi, like, what are you doing? And I realized just how absurd it is, the fact that I'm like zoned out staring at a fish in the middle of class and I'm, you know, having a conversation with it. And so I realized like just how behind I am from schedule, and I go and I shove my hand into it, I get over myself and I rip that fish out and like that, and I go to stick it in the container, and that's when the fish slips from my hands, and that fish goes sailing across the classroom. It goes flying in the air. That fish, it grew wings. Like I saw it, it grew wings and it started to flap and it started to fly. And maybe it only flew about 3 feet, but in my mind it was about 30 feet. And the fish, bam, hits the concrete floor. And I run over there and I grab the fish and I pick it up, and this time I successfully like stick it in the tank. And I am so scared of what my professor is going to do. She's going to yell at me. She's going to fail not only me, but the rules is that if you killed your fish, your whole group is going to fail. And so we're totally done for. We're totally like, you know, all of that. And that was the first time, by the way, that I ever said a 4-letter word that started with an S and screamed it in a classroom as my fish was flying across in its great freedom. It was a pretty crazy day. It was a pretty crazy day. Anyways, much to my relief, our professor, though, has mercy on me and is just laughing. She is hysterically laughing because she realizes that I was in a panic, and yeah, it probably was my fault, oops, that the fish, you know, probably did die after that, but she doesn't say anything, and we just go on about our life, and we continue our lab, and the lab finishes. Eventually we leave that day, I pass the class, you know, things continue on, and I'm here telling you this story. And kind of the paradox of all of this is that I said that I wouldn't remember this lab, and yet that is the only lab that I can clearly recall, because clearly it did have an impact on me, because I just had this mind-blowing epiphany about the importance of like the end of things, and about how so often we think of the end in the moment that we're in, and for the most part it's not. Like for that lab class, that lab was not my end. For the fish, you know, the lab was for, you know, the end there. About a year or so later, in a different class called Ancient Philosophy, we learned this concept called teleology, or teleology, just depending on how you pronounce it. Teleology is like the study of the end. Now, some people take this into a spiritual route, you know, what are we, you know, called to after we're, you know, what happens after death. But then some people look at it as far as like the 4 causes, particularly the final cause. And then some people just look at it as a day-to-day, you know, what is your purpose as a human being? So the purpose of this video is to not only amuse you, hopefully I got a few smiles out of my fish talking story, but is also to tell you about teleology and to remind you to be more mindful of your teleology and your end, and that, you know, what you think is the end probably isn't actually the end, but that you are called to great and to glorious things. And with that, I'm going to sign out, so peace. Lab, and I was probably like, you know, Socrates style, drooling out of my mouth, looking at this fish.